big camera doesn't work, so I have to open up the machine.
Yeah, I think that we can watch you. I see you, but not now.
And now I lost it.
Yeah.
I lost everything.
Are you froze? No, are you there? But you're froze there.
Yeah, well, the thing is, if I open up the thing, I don't need to see myself. So you can you can see me?
No, not at all. Actually,
You can't see me, right?
Can you move your camera?
Well, the thing is that there's a camera on my laptop, and there's supposed to be a camera on my larger screen, but the larger screen camera turns on sometimes and not other times. Let me see, maybe there is a function here, video,
Yeah.
FaceTime HD camera display. No.
Yeah, take your
FaceTime
time.
HD
No problem with
camera.
that.
No. Web plug-in virtual camera. No. No. So it's not going to work like that. But maybe this will now work. Yes, this should now work.
But the other one,
Yeah, this will now work.
Yes, now it's working.
I look messy, but you know, this is it's COVID.
Don't worry.
You know, we're not very elegant in the COVID time. I took an hour's walk. Okay, so yeah, hello. You look great. All of you look great.
Hi, Andrew. I was your student at the new school.
Lima or where?
From Lima, yes.
Yeah. I've been 2 times or 3 times with my friend Nicholas Lynch, and different events. I've been to a favela with Catarina Romero. I've been, but I don't speak Spanish. I know how to read it a little bit, but I can't really speak it, so that's a problem. Okay, so whatever you want to do, we do. So you're
yeah. So Andrew, thank you very much for the time. We are waiting for, maybe we can wait a couple of minutes before, because we are already 5 minutes. Estamos como 5 minutos antes de comenzar, ¿verdad? Entonces podemos, no sé, ¿cómo prefieren? Esperamos como un par de minutos, porque falta un poco más de gente, ¿no?
You know what?
Andrew, my name is...
The people who are here, if they could introduce themselves.
Yes, we are waiting for some of our colleagues a couple of minutes more, because we are.
I heard you say that. Yeah, that's right.
Yes, so
you don't want to do any introductions just now.
Yes, or we can do that. I don't know. Podemos empezar presentándonos de repente antes, ¿sí?
Estemos presentándonos mejor.
Sí, so I don't know, how can I start? So before I want to present Professor Andrew Arato. Professor Andrew Arato is, well, he is professor from the graduate faculty of the New School for Social Research. He is Dorothy Hart Hirschhorn Professor of Political and Social Theory in the Sociology Department at the New School. And he has taught at the L'École des Hautes Études and Science Point Paris, as well as at the Central Europe University in Budapest. And actually, he's giving a course on populism at the New School for Social Research, and also his interests include the politics of civil society, constitutional theory, comparative politics of constitution making, religion, secularism, and constitutions. He also teaches general courses in political sociology, social theory, and sociology of religion. And his concentrations and research topics also include the history of social and political thought, legal and constitutional theory, historical problems of revolutions and radical transformation, and sociology of law. And also he's a very well-known scholar in this discussion about these topics around the world. well, Andrew, we are the Grupo de Investigación en Filosofía Social of the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú, the research group of social philosophy from Peru. Most of us are students of of philosophy, political science, and sociology. And some of us also come from other disciplines which are already related with the social science, as economics or psychology. And well, maybe I can let to my well, first I have to present the coordinator. Our coordinator is the Professor Alessandro Caviglia Marconi. He is the Master of Philosophy from the Pontificia Universidad Católica of Peru. And again, our main research interests are related with political theory, social theory, and social philosophy as in a more broad sense. And actually, in the set of topics that we discuss during our sessions, we have this more specific interest in the current situation of the populism and the political theory of contemporary societies. And especially we are focusing on the case of Peru, but also in the other cases of Latin America. So I don't know if maybe I can give you a space for each of you to present. Maybe de repente les puedo dar a cada uno el espacio para que se presente. Si quiere, puede hacerlo en español o en inglés, cosa que vamos teniendo también nuestro propio espacio. ¿Sí? We can begin with Alessandro. I will let them space for presenting to you, Andrew, each of them individually, so we can start in this way.
Well, I am Alessandro Caviglia. He terminado recién una tesis de doctorado que estoy por sustentar. Es sobre Kant y la sociedad civil, y en esa tesis he estudiado el texto que usted ha publicado junto con Cohen, ese texto grande de los años 90.
Yeah, Professor Alessandro Caviglia said that he is now finishing a PhD dissertation. He's finishing his PhD studies on democratic theory and the topic of civil society. And during this research, he was working your book, the book that you wrote with Jan Cohen, titled Civil Society and Political Theory. So he also known about your work, Andrew. What are the other? Alessandro, puedes continuar.
Y bienvenido al grupo, y no sé si los demás quieren presentarse.
And he said, welcome, Andrew, to the time that we have during this meeting, and thank you very much for your presentation. ¿Quién más? Mario?
Hi, Andrew. It's nice to see you again. I was your student at the new school in the politics program. I took your classes on sociology of law and theories of state formation in 2011, 2012. Good. So it's great to see you again.
Wonderful.
Yes, Mario Pasco. Sandra?
Hi.
Hola, ¿no?
Hi, my name is Sandra. Now I'm a student on a master's degree in government and public policy. I am very interested in issues such as migration and democracy, and now we have an election in 1 month for president and Congress or Parliament, and the second candidate they have the most votes, is an ultra-Catholic, and he's a populist. And I'm really interested in the phenomenon of populism. And yeah.
Thank you, Sandra. Maybe I can move to the, well, I have this order to the left, to the right. So, Gabriel.
Hi. I'm Gabriel Corcuera. I'm a student of philosophy, and I've been working as a professor assistant of many courses of philosophy. I'm right now doing my master's degree investigation is about the relationship between the inability to think and evil, the problem of evil in Hannah Arendt. We are glad to have you here, Professor Arato, so welcome.
Thank you, Gabriel. Jorge?
Hi, my name is Jorge. I am educational psychology. I work doing research and teach psychology classes at the Catholic University. I teach topics related to cognitive development and moral development. And in this moment, I am doing thesis. How do you say thesis?
Yes, a dissertation.
A dissertation in philosophy.
Jorge. Luan.
Good afternoon, Professor Arato. Welcome to our group. My name is Luan. I studied economy, and then I already finished my master's degree in sociology. My interest in research is about luxury studies and consumer and consumption. Thank you.
Thank you, Luan. Rodrigo Oliard.
Good evening. I'm Rodrigo Oliard. I'm cursing my master's in philosophy right now, and I'm making my dissertation on Hannah Arendt and the faculty of judgment and politics. That's it. Glad. Thanks for being here.
Gracias, Rodrigo. Thank you, Rodrigo. Ronald.
Yeah, good afternoon, Professor Arato. My name is Ronald Reyes. I studied law, and currently I am studying philosophy in the master program here in Católica. I am interested in Kantian approaches in contemporary ethics and politics. Yeah, it's wonderful to have this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Ronald. And finally, but not the least, Ángel. Si quieres, como quieras, en español o en inglés, ahí me dices.
Sí, muy buenas tardes, profesor Arato. Mi nombre es Ángel Gómez. Acabo de sustentar una tesis doctoral en Sociología de la Educación en la Universidad de San Marcos. Mi asesor es Nicolás Lynch, fue mi asesor, conozco que es un contacto de usted, Nicolás Lynch. Estoy ahora haciendo mi tesis doctoral en Filosofía Política de la Educación con el profesor Miguel Justi. Muchas gracias por estar aquí, dispuestos a escuchar y conversar con usted. A ver, traduce, César.
Sí, Ángel said that, nice to meet you, Professor Arato. I was finishing a dissertation on sociology of education, and the advisor of that dissertation was also Nicholas Lynch. So he's very glad of having you here today. He's now finishing a dissertation on PhD in philosophy with Professor Miguel Giusti, also on topics of philosophy of education. So this is, so far, this is the basic group of the GIFS, the Group of Investigación en Filosofía Social. So again, Andrew, we are very glad to have you here. thank you very much for the time that you are giving us for discussing the issues that we get, that the main points that we get from your two papers about populism, the theology and populist theory, which is mostly focusing on the theory of Laclau, and also the other paper published in Constellation about sociology and populism. Socialism and populism. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Andrew, and now the floor is yours.
Yeah, if I can say a few words before you begin with the questions. I'm glad you're a student and you work with Nicholas Lynch, who actually was my student. He came to the new school already, I think probably in his 30s, so he was not a very young student, but we interacted a lot and we remained friends. I mention this because his views on populism are quite different than mine. And in fact, he recently taught a course at the new school as a guest lecturer. And it's clear that we really, on this topic, we disagree. All I can say about that is that your group should invite him if he's able and willing to participate in such a session. Is my English okay?
Yeah.
I'm a foreigner in the United States. I was 12 when I got there from Hungary. And I still have an accent, which sometimes makes it harder, especially in the Zoom system. Accents don't come out particularly well. So please, if you don't understand something, either Cesar translates,
yeah,
or I repeat what I said. So the first thing is that it's great that this group is so interdisciplinary. In general, I like that because I was educated in history. My first job was in philosophy. And then for some reason, they hired me in sociology because that's a subject I never really studied formally. But I think that it is not astrophysics. So anyone can really, who learn these other things, can teach sociology too. But interdisciplinary, the field is generally not. It's important that we are interdisciplinary here, not only because of the general desirability of that, but because the topic requires it. I mean, we're dealing with a topic of populism where even a definition would be impossible, I think, without philosophical background, because one needs to reflect on popular sovereignty as an abstract concept before one gets to populism. That would be a sine qua non, that would be a first step. And of course, if we talk about the causality involved, it's impossible to deny now the role, especially for the current challenge of populism, it's impossible to deny the role of the neoliberal epoch, the epoch of the Washington Consensus, in producing the grievances, the incentives, and the justifications even for a populist challenge. And of course, the challenge takes place on a level of politics. Political sociology or political science have to enter. And as Peruvians will know immediately, the topic of populism is not one that begins with the current challenge. Your own country has invented. I don't know too much about this version of populism, the tradition of the opera, but still this goes to the 1930s. So you have a long history now, almost 90 years of this phenomenon, which of course is different in its different epochs, but nevertheless, there are also continuities, greater ones, I would say, in Peru than in the United States, where I think the populism of the late 19th century is not a particularly relevant reference point today, or in Russia, the Narodniki do not represent a significant part of the background of current Russian politics. In Peru, you can tell me how alive opera or its tradition is, but I suspect that because it has made reappearances historically. It's not a dead tradition for sure, like Peronism too, which has made reappearances in history. So in this sense, your country is first of all a very relevant research area for this topic, but I think one has to be also a historian to be able to deal with it adequately. So I think that the fact that we come together, and even psychologists, although I don't work much in psychology, given the type of appeal that populism has, I think a social psychological approach would be certainly relevant in studying it. So I think interdisciplinary approach, that's the first thing I wanted to talk about. The second is Laclau, whom you mentioned. Now, it's true that you read my piece on Laclau, which was my first in this area. I wrote it in 2012 or 13, and I wrote it for a special issue of Social Research on political theology. It was an accident because I just read Laclau. I knew Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau for many years, and I was never really much of a fan, to tell you the truth. Personally, Ernesto is a wonderful gentleman. Chantal was a different story, but in any case, it wasn't a personal matter. You know, from the time that we developed a conception of civil society, these are rival conceptions dealing with the new social movements, rival conceptions dealing with the problem of democratization, and we had very strong disagreements. Not so much political, because in many political contexts we would have agreed, but theoretical. So I happened to have Laclau's book at the time when I was asked to write on political theology, and it just came to me in my head how clearly he's expressing a theological conception of politics in the sense of Carl Schmitt, not in necessarily in every other possible sense. Chantal Mouffe was strongly influenced by Carl Schmitt and always mentions him. Ernesto does not. Ernesto is a harder leftist and had difficulty referring to basically ultimately a fascist thinker. But in any case, certainly the influence is there in Ernesto's book too. So I had this book in my hand, and I adopted it for the purposes of writing an essay on political theology, a topic which I don't particularly didn't intend to really continue. But this got me into populism. Now, Cesar is right. I derive a definition from Ernesto's book. This, I think, however, is a function of my own background in critical theory. In other words, I learned from Marx very early that an immanent criticism of alternative theories is a way to construct our own. Is this a good idea or not? Well, we could talk about this a lot, but it's undeniable that that's what Marx did with respect to political economy. Adam Smith, Ricardo, Jean-Baptiste, he took apart their work, accepted what he could from them, found the things that they occluded or repressed or made invisible, and brought these things to the surface in a name of a political project contrary to even the most leftist of the political economists of his own time. That, of course, changed under Marx's influence. Political economy, as Cesar knows, has also now many leftist options within it. But at the time of Marx's writing, it was always a way of explaining, to some extent, engineering capitalist development. And Marx wanted to break with that development clearly, but he thought that the best way to understand it is through the best theories, the best forms of self-reflection emerging from political economy itself. This is the Hegelian strategy, ultimately. Those of you who are philosophers like Ronald and others will know this idea, because Hegel has produced a whole history of philosophy through transforming through a kind of critical reconstruction the works of older greats. And Marx followed Hegel in this respect. And I was always struck by this, not on my own, but because this is the method that people I admired, Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, eventually Jürgen Habermas adopted. And I wanted to adopt it, and I did this to Laclau. It's something no one cares to notice. But I do want to say it because I already said with respect to Nicholas Lynch that I disagree with him on the question of populism. I disagree even more strongly with Ernesto Laclau with his normative project. Nevertheless, I use his work to reconstruct the meaning of that project. And I do this also because there's a battle of definitions around. I don't know how many books on populism people here have read, but you will see that each of these works defines the phenomenon differently. The debate is between people who use a thin definition and a thick definition. If you use a thin definition and you say, for example, that a politics that challenges representative democracy in the name of popular sovereignty, which is neglected under most versions of representative democracy, that's a very thin definition. Even if you add to it something like a Manichaean view of the social, it is still a pretty thin definition. A lot of things will fall under it. For example, Bolshevism, which I'm teaching Trotsky's book on the Russian Revolution to undergraduates tomorrow. Certainly Trotsky would be a populist from this point of view, but fascism too might fall under this heading, although their populist sovereignty was usually replaced with national sovereignty, which is a related concept anyway. So that's the problem with a thin definition. And a thick definition, such as my friend Federico Finkelstein at the New School uses, he has 16 items which define populism. In my mind, this leads to nothing but Peronism, which is what he has studied. That's where he comes from. And he has defined the Peronist phenomenon historically pretty well. But obviously, this will not travel well even to neighboring countries like Peru and Ecuador and Bolivia. And to prove this is to show I can show that I'm right, because Federico links populism to fascism at a historical moment when one can no longer be a fascist. That's his idea. Cesar knows this, right? Because Federico had a chance to present this, and maybe Mario too had a chance to encounter this. And this is right for Perón, right? The man was a fascist to begin with. And what did he do? He transformed this thing pretty radically, but still some elements of that early fascist. I don't know if opera can be explained this way already, right? No, Cesar says no. But so this means that certainly if you wanted to understand Chavez and Venezuela, you wanted to understand Morales, you wanted to understand Podemos, all these various populisms today, this idea is just not going to work. So a thick definition of that type is a problem, a thin definition is a problem. So where to find the right kind of definition? And here Ernesto's idea helps because he has 5 or 6 characteristics defining the phenomenon. And moreover, I like to use it because it means that I'm not attributing authoritarian features to populism myself. I'm taking it from the horse's mouth. Do you know this English expression? To take something from the, well, how would you say that in Spanish? I don't know if you actually talk about the caballo and the, I don't even know the word.
It's like taking it from the horse's mouth. It's like tomar de la boca del caballo, pero tenemos un equivalente en español, ¿no?
Yeah, if okay, well, we don't have.
No, but that's okay. I mean, maybe it's an English expression.
You
like...
can't say this in Hungarian. People look at you. What kind of horse and what kind of mouth? But I'm taking it from somebody who actually wants to prove the opposite point, namely that this is the most available radical democratic alternative. And so, in that sense, I think I have the advantage that I'm using in a way the norm. This is the way that Horkheimer and Adorno have taught me, the norm that is already there in Laclau, but to show that that his version of populism cannot satisfy that norm. That's what's called immanent criticism. Adorno has an important piece on this, cultural criticism of society. Must be in Spanish, because Spanish translates everything, and you can find this text. It was in prisons originally in terms of the Adorno volume, if you're interested. Habermas talks about this too in a great essay on Walter Benjamin, and I'm influenced by them, so I adopted this framework. But you can see that it's not like law speaking, it's me turning him in a different direction than he himself wanted to go. Okay, maybe so much for a beginning. Otherwise, Gene and I have just written a book, so I can go on, but this should not be a lecture. I mean, you have read a couple of my essays. I can send you other ones. Gene too has written other things on it. Eventually the book will be out, and I can share some of it probably earlier. So, a lecture, what's the point? I'm not going to go on, and I'd rather address the kind of questions that you would come up with in this particular context. And so I'll stop, and Cesar will help with those questions which have to be formulated in Spanish. I made a pledge that I'm going to learn Spanish, and then we wrote an English book instead. I'm still signed up with a program teaching me Spanish, but I know something about the grammar now and a little vocabulary, but unfortunately, I cannot understand spoken Spanish.
Yes, that's okay. I can start with some of the questions that we already formulate. I also creo que he puesto las preguntas en inglés, pero si tienen acceso al enlace que trabajamos la vez pasada, pueden también ver algunas de las preguntas que formulamos anteriormente. Entonces, si quieren, las pueden formular ahora ustedes, o si tienen alguna otra que recién se les haya ocurrido, me dicen y les ayudo un poco con el inglés. Háganla en español, no hay problema. Entonces procedemos así. Cada uno me dice quién quiere comenzar, entonces prende su micrófono, hace la pregunta en inglés o español. Si es en español, yo la traduzco, ¿ok? No sé, Alessandro, Ronald, Sandra, Mario, Ángel, Gabriel, Rodrigo, Luan, Jorge, ¿quién quiere comenzar?
César, una consulta. Perdón,
Sí.
ya, las preguntas están en orden, ¿no?
Sí, pero pueden tomar también, digamos, yo les he puesto allí para que recuerden, pero me avisan.
Okay. No,
sí.
solo usa la consulta para poder
Sí.
saber cuál
Sí, y usen, así es, y usen también la herramienta de mano si pueden, o si no también solo con la mano en la cámara. Okay, Ronald has a question, Andrew. So I think that he's gonna formulate it in English by himself, right? Yeah.
Well, thank you, Professor Arato. My first question is about the ethics implicit in the phenomenon of populism. If we take this division between the ethical and the political in the Rawlsian approach, from that schema, it seems that populism is more closely connected with radical politics, as in the description offers by Walser. We can consider this phenomenon, which Weber called the inner worldly asceticism. I mean, this kind of battle against the world. So it seems that populism carries an implicit compromise or duty to change everything according to a singular ethical perspective. In this case, the perspective of the true people. So my question would be, has populism inherently this ethical claim contrary to the political plurality?
Well, it's not something that I've thought about very much, because on some level in the literature, people focus on the political phenomenon and its political forms of self-expression and political discourses. But there is something, let's say with my definition, which you can see in the essays that you looked at, you can see my definition at least one component which has a very strongly ethical dimension, and that is the feature that has been called a Manichaeanism. That's an ethical view, right? In other words, the moralization of social conflict. Now, of course, this is not characteristic of populism. I told you I'm teaching Trotsky's amazing book on the Russian Revolution. It's an amazing book, even if I, of course, disagree with a lot. And Trotsky treats everybody, almost with the exception of himself and Lenin, in moral terms. I mean, his term for them is, the term for the other socialists is compromisers. That's not a compliment. And friend-enemy relations enter at all kinds of stages. But whether populism and radical socialism overlap in some respects or not, what is clear that they overlap in this respect, and of course fascism too, even perhaps more radically constructs friend-enemy relation. Now, if you're a follower of Carl Schmitt, you will say that's all politics. All serious politics is like this, right? In which case, my criticism would be completely impotent and irrelevant because I'm criticizing them for something that has got to be a feature of the political, but I don't share that. I think that the ethos of democracy always has an element of tolerance within it. I think that the ethos of democracy has always within it respect for difference and an idea, and in this sense, all real democracy in a modern world is liberal, that even the opponents with whom we fight and struggle nevertheless have rights. Right? That they have rights to speak, to their privacy, to their ability to publish, and so on. Now, I don't claim that all populism in this respect is radically anti-liberal. And that, of course, becomes a matter also if you study the democratic claims of populism. But the logic, which is different than the empirical, right? I think you understand the distinction. The logic of interpreting politics in terms of a Manichaean view of the real, authentic people, that's my side, and everybody else as the enemy, is anti-liberal in this respect, and not just anti-liberal, but potentially violent. Potentially violent. That doesn't mean that this logical potential is realized in every single instance of populism, but this is part of the ethos, and I think that for me it is definitional. Now, for my definition, you could say, well, but aren't there populists, people called populists or parties called populists, that do not share this characteristic? I think that some of the US populism of the late 19th century certainly can be judged innocent of the charge I just made. And perhaps Podemos in Spain, there are exceptions. But my understanding of the contemporary phenomenon is that that the characteristics that I list as definitional are present in so many places that I think we can treat them as common, even though there will be exceptions. I mean, obviously there will be exceptions with respect to other matters too. For example, pluralism. That could be also understood as an ethical issue. It is just the other side of the friend-enemy conception of politics. Somebody pluralist cannot see the other versions of the plurality as enemies. We are competitors, right? As in sports, you compete against the other football team, right? What football teams can I name? Let's say Real Madrid and Barcelona. I know you're not Spanish and Peru, you have different teams, but I don't really know Peruvian football. Are the players of Barcelona and Real Madrid strong competitors who fight against each other in a pretty determined and intense way? Yes, they are. Do they think of each other as enemies? No. And why don't they? Well, one reason is that a player in one team could be eventually on the other team. It could happen, right? Even in football. You know, in pluralistic politics, today there's a coalition of one group, but maybe tomorrow I could be part of a coalition with some of them. So they cannot just be my enemies. They can be competitors, but they're also in some sense partners in a common field. So I would say that these two issues, friend-enemy relations and anti-pluralism, are significant features of the logic of populism. Again, empirically in different settings, they would not be necessarily realized in the same way because of all kinds of issues that belong to the specific country tradition. Okay, I stop with this.
Thank you, Andrew. So we have in the queue Rodrigo first, and then Mario.
Should we do them one by one, or should we do them?
Maybe if, I don't know, maybe we can have a list of 2 questions, and then you take the time for answers.
If Rodrigo, for example, makes a very long question.
Yes, it depends on, yes.
Better. If he doesn't, then we can have Mario. Maybe, you know, you can chair and decide.
Yeah.
But me, you know, to keep everything in mind when I hear really a lot.
Yeah.
Becomes a challenge.
Okay. Yeah, that's true. Rodrigo, vas a ser corta o larga la pregunta, no hay problema. Tú, ahí vamos viendo.
Gracias. The question is basically if there's a relationship of confrontation between the idea of populism and globalization, because in the answer you have just given, there's this idea of popular sovereignty over a particular space, physical space, which is, I know, the national delimitations. So if there's, is there a confrontation? Populism is inherently anti-globalization or not?
Well, yes. It's a short question and very clear one.
Yes.
So maybe we can have Mario.
Yes. Mario, you are mute. Tienes que quitarle el... Okay.
All right, yes. My question is connected to Peruvian politics. One of the consequences of the government of Alberto Fujimori in the 1990s and his constant attack on traditional party politics was the destruction of this system of political representations through the parties. So since the 2000s, in most electoral processes, instead of having a few strong political parties, we have approximately 20 political movements or political organizations competing for the presidency or the parliament. So my question is, as in Peru, we are in a crisis of representation through political parties, how can we face populism in this context? Is it possible to face to challenge populism when you no longer have strong political parties?
Great, these are fantastic questions, and they're not even long. So, you know, my expectation that the questions will be very long, I won't keep them in mind.
Maybe, do you think that maybe we can gather one more question, or do you think it's enough?
You're trying to tax my brain. Okay.
No, I mean that.
Okay. Globalization, political parties, and we can have a third. Okay.
Yes. Does anybody, ¿alguno más tiene alguna otra pregunta?
I have a question.
Yes. Okay, Gabriel.
I would like to know what will be the main problems that democracy have in itself, that enable democracy, avoid populism.
Well, that's great too. So let me start with that one. Because logically for me, that's the first question. So, of course, you know that liberal democracy with a high level of inclusion is really a 20th century phenomenon. I mean, nowhere are women included in the electorate in liberal democracies. Well, that's not quite true. Some US states in the 19th century played with this, maybe some Swiss cantons too. But generally, women's participation is 20th century. Half the population, right? Democracy with half the population out. And you know, of course, that historically there are many other exclusions based on property and all kinds of other things. So democracy is new. But nevertheless, its idea, its fundamental idea, the fundamental idea of modern democracy, which is not that of the ancient city-states, is representation. And that's not 20th century. That's medieval in Europe. And of course, you have had different versions of this in different European states, in Latin America also, interestingly, and North America also. So representation is pre-democratic, but it's a key vehicle for democracy. It's a pre-democratic institution. Think of the estates of the European old regime, the orders, and of course you imported them into Latin America too. Peru especially, center of the one of the centers of the empire, obviously had this kind of structure. So democracy inherits an institution from pre-democracy. And this means that from the outset, there's a democratic deficit within the structure. And it's not based on even the exclusions. It is based on the gap between representative and represented. It's a fundamental problem, right, of all democracies. You know, I'm doing the Russian Revolution with the Soviets and councils, and this issue, of course, comes up. But it comes up in many settings, in many places, and especially during revolution. So there is a problem in democracy. And in this sense, populism, on a most abstract level, coexists with democracy to begin with, because it challenges the idea of representative democracy is challenged from the outset in the name of more democracy. Populists are not the only ones who do this. Anarchists do this in some other way. Council communists do it in some other way. But populists, whatever else they do this. And in this sense, there is an inherent challenge. And that challenge becomes especially relevant. And now I go to the other two questions, basically. When certain things happen to the system of representation, I guess I'll go with Mario first, because he's the one who spoke about crisis of representation. Now, that is a term which is used by many analysts of populism. Populism comes into being when there's a crisis of representation. When is there a crisis of representation? In my idea is when the process of democratization stops. That is, democracy, in the sense of representative democracy, is viable only if it is open to further democratization. I already mentioned women's suffrage. That's one such a step. Allowing people with no property to vote is another step. Giving the youth vote is another step. Introducing local government, which France, for example, has not introduced until relatively recently, autonomous local government, is another step. Industrial democracy would be another step, right? Workers' control, workers' self-management. So there are a lot of ways of democratizing this inherited representative democratic structure. I think there's a crisis when that thing stops, the process of democratization, or when it's even reversed. And globalization, namely Rodrigo's point, is exactly a moment when there can be a reversal. because think about the Danish vote against Maastricht. You know about this? Denmark first rejected the European Union, or rather the treaty, the Maastricht Treaty, which changed the European Union, because of the idea was that we have a really pretty well-working democracy here, and you are forcing us into a technocratic setting in which we're going to lose control over many of our own affairs, which we decide democratically. I'm not a fan of Brexit. I'm an opponent of it. But still, even Brexit has this component, right? Namely that there's a technocracy in Brussels that is deciding for us. And we, the English, are used to parliamentary sovereignty, deciding who makes decisions for us. And now it's on all kinds of issues, hundreds of economic matters, is these unelected people in Brussels, the Commission, that makes these decisions. Now, Rodrigo's point goes beyond Europe. It goes to the globe. But I think that your point can be reformulated in another way, because it's not only that populism then becomes a problem from the point of view of globalization, but globalization also gives rise to it. This is Danny Roderick's argument. He's an economist. He has written on populism extensively. I assigned him in class. You can read his essays, which are short and good. He is really one of the best economists. I don't know if Cesar will agree with that. The new school, he may not be radical enough for these guys. But in any case, Roderick writes on populism and shows the popular populism comes into being precisely because of the loss of control of the democratic electorate over its own affairs. And so they say, well, we must resist this. And who is to do it? Certainly not our parties, which have abandoned their ideas of social Europe, social democracy, engaging in various bait and switch strategies to get elected. By the way, Fujimori did it too. He got elected on one set of claims, and then he too, like many social democrats elsewhere, turned also neoliberal once in power. Perhaps this was predictable, and you guys would know that better. In any case, once that happens, populists have really an advantage, because democratization has halted. We have democratized on Denmark, and now the Danish democracy is under the rule of the European Commission and the various organizations enforcing the treaties. The European Central Bank would be another important instance of this. So we must figure out a politics that resists that, and populism. And look, Scandinavian countries all have, how is that possible? They have social democracies that people in the United States and probably also in Peru could only dream of today, right? And yet they do have this populist option emerging in response to globalization. Now, the point that Rodrigo actually asked has to do with the conflict then between globalization and populism once they are in power. Part of this is what they promised. We're gonna reduce the power of these undemocratic instances over our lives. But they do more than what they promised, because interestingly enough, even if certain parts of the European Union, certain dimensions of European policy are unpopular in many of the countries, my country, Hungary, for example, in general, Europe is popular. The free movement of labor from country to country is popular. Why? If I cannot get a good job in Hungary, why can't I get one in Sweden? People like that. It's great, to be European in that way, to be free to go to different European countries and to be protected in terms of my rights by different governments, and to be able to work under different conditions. It raises even the value of labor power, right? Because if I could sell it in Sweden, why should I get a lower wage in Hungary? And the populists, by clamping down on this dimension are also interfering with important elements of freedom that people like. We had this problem under Trumpism too. People like the protection of certain kinds of labor against the Chinese, but no one liked higher prices at Walmart's or Walgreens for Chinese-made goods. Who likes that, right? So there is a contradiction in this, and yet populists do carry out their threat against global integration. Now, I'm not suggesting what the answer would be. I think it's pretty obvious. If the democracy deficit drives you against globalization, why not democratize the dimension of globalization? I mean, Europe could be made much more democratic. And so could the WTO and the World Bank. All these could be made more responsive to democratic bodies and democratic inputs. But still, we don't have those responses today, and the populists can make propaganda against globalization, and they do carry out some of their threats, not all of their threats. They're in no hurry to destroy their local economies. Okay,
Yes.
I think I answered all three of you in some way, but of course, keeping the three questions in mind makes me give perhaps a somewhat peculiar answer to some of you. Oh, I didn't go into the parties.
Yeah, the parties, yes, this is the other issue.
Forget it. Yeah, it's a good thing that I'm free associating it. So yes, so Mario, yes, I didn't go into that. Now, populism, this is the literature now, tends to respond these days to the phenomenon called party cartelization, cartel parties, which means that the competing parties have all adopted themselves to more or less the same set of policies and slogans, and in the context of globalization, to the technocratic requirement of global institutions, European and international. And in this sense, opposition disappears. Populism typically responds to partocracia, I guess you would say it in Spanish, right? Or
Partidocracia.
Yeah, because in different Spanish dialects, I noticed it has a different name. Partidocracia, partocracia, but everybody gets the idea. The parties are oligarchic, they make deals, and real democracy disappears among them. This is also a way of halting democratization. If the parties become similar, then of course representation for a lot of people who wish for something else is lost. Now, what happens? And your question was, what happens with the opposite phenomenon when there's a huge fragmentation of parties, right? Which you say is the Peruvian. It is not the normalcy in many other countries, except under the impact of populism itself. Populism itself can lead to party fragmentation because the claim that I am the people, anybody can say, Arato can say, I am the American people. We can all say that. Any one of you could say, yo soy Peru, right? I am Peru, or your little group is Peru. So this is a game many people can play. And in some countries, you have serial populisms where alternative groups and claimants arise. In Europe, Italy would be the best example of this, where there are 3 or 4 populist formations: the Northern League, the 5 Star, Berlusconi's formation. They're smaller ones. Italy has traditionally a kind of fragmentation of the party framework, and populism just gives that a different shape. So it's up to you to tell me if in Peru it is populism that produces this or helps to produce the fragmentation. You said Fujimori destroyed the older parties. And so in that sense, populism of his version might have had something to do with the subsequent fragmentation. But whether all these fragments are themselves populist or not, I bet some of them are.
Yeah.
If you have 30 parties in Peru, my guess would be that 3 or 4 of them offhand are pretty populist. That's just a hypothesis.
Yes.
And that's because such a long tradition of this type of mobilization. But in any case, that raises the question of whether populism is going to be viable in such a setting. Because if so many people make that kind of claim, then the voter will say, well, it's nonsense. You know, you can't have 4, 5, 6 groups all claiming that they are Peru. And so in that sense, one would expect that somebody who's able to integrate different political parties and create some kind of viable coalition of actors would have a better chance, yet another, you know, spin-off from opera, or a spin-off from Fujimori himself, like his daughter, right? You know, you have these people, but you know, they are all the same old thing, you know, Alan Garcia, Keijo Fujimori, you know, they look like caricatures of the thing that went on before. So in such a setting, I don't think that populism has a big advantage, but it does have it when there is a cartelization of parties. That's when it has the big advantage. So no, I did answer this one too. These questions are great, by the way. I'm really impressed. No, I think it's really because these questions can be about anything, but these questions really cut into the phenomenon in an interesting way. By the way, I don't know too much about what's going on in Peru, so everything I said about it could be completely wrong.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Thank you very much, Andrew. That's very, very. You get to the point. Actually, that's not so dismissing with that. So before Rodrigo, because I know that you have another question, maybe we have another person who has yes, Sandra. Sandra, and maybe who else? Luan, Jorge, or Angel, or Alessandro. I don't know. Okay, first Sandra, and then I'm gonna gather the other questions.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. I have a question that is linked to Mario's question about representation crisis, because some authors like Carlos de la Torre speak of a democratizing moment of populism. And the idea is that populist movements politicize some issues that are important to the people, no? And that is the link with the representation crisis, because in some part, like in Peru or in Latin America, the people or person has the sensation of injustice, right? And my question is if you think that populists have these moments in some way, in movements or in government. I know in government it's more difficult because they have a tendency for authoritarianism. But like movements, I don't know if you have an opinion of that. Thank you.
See, now you're answering your question, your own question too, and I would have answered exactly on those lines. Is that contrary to Laclau, if you don't mind, I'll do this one because I can do this quickly. Contrary to Laclau, I think that there are different organizational forms of populism. He never says that, right? He never talks about it in power. He doesn't talk about the party even. But we all know that there are movements and their parties and their governments, and we even say there are regimes, although it's hard to define what the threshold for that is. And the way Sandra was answering your own question is exactly what I would do, namely to say that the relation to democracy changes from movement to government, and then of course it becomes very negative if a populist regime is formed. So it's really, even the party is more authoritarian than the movement. So interestingly, even though this is not a stage model, I don't think that necessarily happens that there's a movement first, a party second, the government third, a regime fourth. It need not happen in that order. But logically, there's a relation, and the problem of democracy becomes different as you go from one to the other. I mean, she said this already, but that's crucial, I think. Now, because the problem is a democracy deficit, which comes into being because of the halting of the logic of democratization, there's plenty to criticize about existing democracies, and populist movements do that. They say things which council communists, radical Democrats, even radical liberals can actually see and point out. In this sense, populism participates as a critique, as a critical movement in the critique of democracy, and it could lead to a self-correction. And I think this is what Carlos de la Torre means. By the way, he's also a student of mine. Carlos was a student, I think, a little later than Nicholas. No, maybe not. Maybe even just from the same time. I don't even remember anymore. You can check it on his curriculum vitae. But he's a student of mine with whom I work closely, and with him I agree more on the topic of populism. But he points out too this democratizing dimension. Now, why can the democratizing dimension be the basis of of democratic expansion when in government? Well, it has to do with this problem that we're speaking in the name of the people when we're not in power, and that means to point out logically what is undemocratic about the existing setup. But once we're in power and we speak in the name of the people, and only we can do that, that leads to authoritarianism. And there are other things that produce it. For example, the failure of many promises. I mean, no one doubts, right, in your case, that Fujimori's regime was authoritarian. We always say this about right-wing populism. Most of us tend to be in these discussions more on the left than the right. But, you know, you have a sufficient number of examples of left populism in power to realize there's a problem there too. Okay, I stop at this, but Sandra and I are on the same wavelength, so I don't have to really push the point much further, except that let me say that when a movement, let me just sum it up. When a movement, populism tends to can easily have a democratizing dimension and lead to possible democratization. When a government, it will depend on contextual givens, whether it will be authoritarian or how authoritarian it will be. Since you know Latin America, let's compare Correa's Ecuador with Morales's Bolivia and Chavez's Venezuela, and the existence of let us say the free press would be one interesting democratic measuring. The ability of independent movements to function would be another. And you will see that the three are different in those respects. And I think this has to do with the local givens, the elements of existing politics which have to be adhered to or used or made even coalitions with, because if there are strong other forces that cannot just be easily welded into the populist bloc, then you know, a constitution will be made which will have more pluralism in it, and the political processes will emerge which indicate the presence of still a democratizing potential. I mean, think about how the issue of presidential succession was solved in Bolivia against Venezuela. And you see two different outcomes, with institutions playing two different roles. And I think that is a function of the political context in which a populist government has to operate.
Thank you, Andrew. We have another question from Alessandro. Alessandro, tienes que quitar el mute. Estás mudo. Okay.
You have to unmute him, I think.
No, that's okay.
Ok. Voy a hacerlo en español, ¿ya?
Ya, está bien.
Kant distingue entre el pensamiento dogmático y el pensamiento crítico, ¿no? El pensamiento dogmático es aquel que piensa que hay algo así como una naturaleza de las cosas, por ejemplo, una naturaleza humana, una naturaleza del pueblo, por ejemplo. Cambio, digamos, la crítica lo que hace es más bien señalar que no es posible tener esos conocimientos. La pregunta sería, ¿el populismo tiene una concepción dogmática del pueblo y de la política o no? ¿O es una concepción crítica?
Okay, Andrew, I'm going to translate. So Alessandro said that Immanuel Kant distinguishes between a dogmatic thought and a critical thought, or a dogmatic thinking and a critical thinking. So there will be, for instance, as a set of ideas of the first type, specific claims related to a sort of nature of the people, like a thick idea of the people. But in contrast, the critical thought would reject this kind of idea of the people, as in the case of a dogmatic thought. So the question of Alessandro is, does populism have a dogmatic, it's related to a dogmatic thread of thinking, or it's a critical one?
Well, you know, you can have the kind of thing we talked about with Sandra. You can have populism exercising critique. The term is a very broad one, right? And, you know, I mean, fascists criticize liberalism, and people who are into theocratic forms of government criticize secularism. So lots of different people can criticize. But what he means, what Alessandro means by critical, and this is the way I always interpreted it, in spite of the problems of this in the Marxian tradition, is that you have to be also self-critical. It's not enough to be critical of everybody, but you have to understand. For example, I'm reading this very great guy, great mind, Trotsky. You should all read The Russian Revolution if you have a week to kill like I just did. It's such a wonderful book. There's no element of self-criticism in it at all. Zero. Brilliant. He's brilliant. He's fantastic. He's so able to put together politics and history and sociology and even a kind of social psychology, philosophy, even in the background. But there's not an element of self-criticism in his thought at all. Zero. In fact, it's very important in the book that Trotsky always has to be right. Even creates a problem with Lenin because in a way he wants to use Lenin against the Stalinists, and yet he had disagreements with Lenin. And so in a way, sometimes he's facing a choice, and it's rare. Maybe I'm wrong. And you'll find a passage where he says Lenin was right and I was wrong, but Trotsky, because he speaks about himself in the third person. But self-criticism is essential, right? And that means, you know, that in this friend-enemy construct, you have to imagine that maybe the people I'm debating with, maybe they are right on some things. You know, this talk about the neoliberals, this is an issue that all of you will have to face, right? Are the neoliberals wrong about everything? I'm sure you're tempted, some of you are tempted to say that. And yet, if you are going to take seriously economics, you'll probably will wind up admitting that at some points they were right. You can't just do what Chavez did and distribute the resource. You have to economize with the resource in some way. The Norwegians were much closer to neoliberalism than Chavez was, and the Norway economy is still functioning. The Venezuelan one has collapsed. Yes, I know the United States plays a role, sanctions and all the rest. Nevertheless, his economics was stupid. And the neoliberals could have told him that. So, you know, in a way, in politics, we have to really imagine that on some issues, we could be wrong. And when we criticize, we also have to, you know, the Maoists had sessions, criticism, self-criticism. They didn't mean it. They didn't mean that we wanted to criticize Mao too. They just thought that self-criticism means that you can criticize Liu Shaoqi maybe, or Chu Enlai, but never Mao himself. I don't know about Mao ever criticizing himself. It's an interesting question in his text, whether you can actually find a passage where he will say, I, Mao Zedong, was wrong. And Lenin was not given to that either, so he changed his mind very frequently. So dogmatic thought is really the problem. And populism, now look, I mean, I cannot say that this is 100% true because, you know, Allo Presidente was a radio or television program, right? And Hugo Chavez appeared on TV every week. And these things must be on tape. And I think Correa had a program too. Fujimori was not foolish enough to do this kind of stuff, I don't think, right?
Yeah, no, he has his own newspapers, not
well, yeah,
his
but
own,
that's
but
a little different than being
yeah.
on TV when you free associate and say all kinds of stuff. You know, that's so when you find some, you listen to all these Chavez broadcasts, Allo Presidente, it's a beautiful title. I remember it, right? You probably will find moments when he says, oh, no, Chavez was wrong on this point, and now we know better. Maybe you can find this. It's not for real, it's play acting. It's play acting. Because the idea that yo soy Venezuela is the most self-critical idea that you could ever say. I mean, how can one person speak for a country of what, 15 million, 15, 16 million in Venezuela? It's not one people, right? It's not the people. It's heterogeneous in all kinds of respects. Economic differences, religious differences, cultural differences, regional differences, ethnic differences even. It just means that there are different interests, different perspectives, different ways of looking at the world. For one man, Hugo Chavez, to say, I can speak for all of it, is a fundamentally dogmatic idea. It's something that Lenin never even did, or Trotsky. They kind of wanted the party to be able to speak for the people as a whole, or at some moment the Soviets, but it wasn't personal. It the fewer the subject speaking, the worse it gets. You could imagine a party like the Bolshevik Party have different groups in it that engage in internal discussions, and so in the end they can speak for the Russian people because they had a vigorous debate. As during Lenin's time, there were still vigorous debates. But once you really have a leader like Stalin, there's no question. And of course, you can see that Marxist thought becomes more and more rigid, more and more dogmatic, more and more uncritical. So of course, I think that this uncritical dimension is built into the way that the people are conceptualized in populism. Because if the people are plural or heterogeneous, then I, who represents one perspective, could be just as wrong as anybody else. Now, they give me, of course, in a democracy, the authorization to act in their name. But I have to be open to being rejected and outvoted. And I should not be in the business of changing the electoral rules in such a way that I can succeed myself indefinitely, or that I cannot lose an election, which is what populist leaders, of course, do, right? They try to transform a democratic authorization, which these days always initially is a democratic authorization. Chavez is elected, Correa is elected, Morales is elected in democratic election. Fujimori was too before his autogolpe. He was not authorized to carry out an autogolpe, right? So in that sense, he acted as a populist who would act under those circumstances. But when Morales decided, and he's the most attractive one in your part of the world, and Morales decided that even a referendum that he lost doesn't count, and he can go to a handpicked court and have the handpicked court say that, no, you can run for more terms in spite of the referendum. That means I cannot be voted out. I cannot be made accountable for what I've done or what I have not done. So yes, it is a fundamentally dogmatic, uncritical form of thought, which of course, back to Sandra's point, can be linked to criticisms when out of power. But once in power, that criticism, the reduction of the media, a common phenomenon in all these settings, right? The media are eliminated because I cannot be criticized except by enemies. If somebody criticizes me in strong terms, that person or those people are just enemies. And so they should not be given. The people are under no obligation to let their enemies who seek to destroy them speak. But that's true by definition. Now, you know, right, I'm not suggesting that Syriza or Podemos necessarily have done exactly that. But it is a common feature. How was the freedom of press under Fujimori's period of rule? You tell me. My prediction is that it was not in good shape. Did he eliminate it altogether? Did he jail journalists and reporters? Did he intimidate? Were people beaten up or even killed?
No, he bought them. He bought them.
He bought them. Well, that's a nice way. You buy them. You buy them. That's what Berlusconi has done too. That's a way. You buy them. But that's the same thing. Rewards and sanctions, right, are other sides of the same coin. It's nicer to give somebody a lot of money than to kill them. Maybe that was, you know, his modus operandi. He tended to believe in positive sanctions, but it is not the freedom of the press.
That's very interesting.
It might be good that you said that because the instruments, once you're in government, there are many instruments, many things you can do. It's need not be like Putin, that you need not poison with strange radioactive poisons your opponents. I mean, you know, that's a pretty crude Russian way of dealing with the problem. But, you know, in Peru, you're more civilized, and he's a Japanese guy anyway. So he inherits the culture of a long civilization where you use more refined methods.
That's true. That's true.
I'm kidding. I'm joking.
Being a populist with a style. That's
maybe that's not no populist in Peru kills people necessarily. That's possible.
Yeah, that's.
Your right wing sometimes kills people, but the populist, perhaps this is not. You know, Peronism in Argentina, there were people jailed. Mm-hmm. So there was repression. Anyway, it depends on the setting and depends on the challenge and depends on really the threat. Because the very nice methods will not work anymore once the threat becomes really global. You know, once you have enough people opposed to you, you can't buy them. That method works with a few journalists, But once it is, a third of the population, they need more clearer forms of reglementation. Okay, I stop.
Thank you, Andrew. Voy a hacer dos preguntas. Luan. Luan wanna make a specific question, Andrew.
Yes.
Sorry, Cesar.
No, that's okay. No, that's okay. Go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, my question is about the role of social society. Okay, what is the role of social society in the emergence of populism? Is there a possibility of a presence of a strong civil society when we have been in a long populism regime, like in Peru or other countries in Latin America?
Yes.
The first word was socialism.
No, this civil society, I think that she
mentioned. Civil society, I understood. That I understood, but I thought you mentioned socialism.
Oh, no, populism.
Well, because the reason why I want to go with that, even though I misunderstood what you first said, is because socialism can be, of course, what Kesmerde and Kaltwasser call host ideologies for populism. I haven't mentioned that concept, but they say rightly, and it's consistent with Laclau's idea of chain of equivalence, that populisms have a thin ideology on their own. The idea that we are the people are one, the people are fighting against an enemy that wants to destroy them is not yet a real ideology. And in order to actually be able to generate a program, in order to gain sufficient support, especially in elections, you rely on other ideologies generally. Now, 21st century socialism, that's Chavez, certainly Morales, Mas is a socialist party. So socialism can be one of those thin ideologies. As you know from European cases, as you know from Fujimori, neoliberalism too can be a host ideology under some settings. I'm a little unclear if Fujimori relied on that during his electoral campaign initially, but he surely began to speak in a neoliberal way, appealing to the external economy, the second economy, the precariat, which was not historically dependent on state interventionism, regulation, and welfare state type measures. So neoliberalism can be host ideology. Interesting question, and this is the way I'm going to interpret your point, Luan's point, whether civil society can be a host ideology for populism. In other words, whether the idea of relying on civil associations, on civil initiatives, on grassroots movements, on a variety of forms of critique emerging from below, is possible for populism or not. And this brings me back to the exact same point I've discussed with Sandra before. I keep on returning to this, is that there's a difference here between populism as a movement and populism as a government. As a movement, it is one of civil society's movements. And certainly, as a part of civil society, you are strengthened by some relatively friendly relationship to other civil society initiatives. And this can take the form, but this can take different forms depending the country where you are. In a place where ecological movements are very strong, it is ecological initiatives that would be relevant. Where feminism is strong, where ethnic groups, and this is the case of Bolivia, where indigenous movements have been strong, it is very likely that you will link yourself to that type of initiative when in opposition. Peronism, of course, amazingly enough, given the background of Juan Perón himself, is going to team up with the labor movement. It's going to team up with the labor movement. Is this true for opera too in Peru? Cesar says, yes, I always watch your face and you either say yes or no.
Yeah.
And,
no, yes, because they began as an artist group.
Help me. And I would imagine that Populismo originally was labor-oriented too. I think this is also true for the PRI, right, in Mexico. Not so comfortable about putting Cardenas under the heading of populism, because it is also a radical democratic movement, although later on the PRI becomes more like the standard populist initiative. But in any case, the labor movement plays a significant role for PRI, the peasant movements too. That was the important achievement of the PRI, right, is that it created structures within which peasants, independent peasants, cooperative peasants, and workers could be included. It became a kind of corporatist structure. In any case, in this sense, certainly there is a possibility, especially on a level of a critical movement, to have links to a variety of civil society initiatives. Now, definitionally, once in power, I would say the link to civil society becomes much more problematic. Because civil society, whatever else you're going to say about it, whether we are talking about in Hegelian or Marxist terms or in more contemporary terms like ours, the gene, is pluralistic. And so to link yourself to pluralism means exactly the opposite of the dogmatism that we just discussed. You have to sort of accept that it is your movement, let us say the coca growers have a lot of important insights, but so do the indigenous, and so does the mestizo movement in the same country, and the older labor movement. And this becomes impossible even for a moralist. So predictably, they enter into conflict with these other movements. One of the ways they do so is to attack their press. But the other one is take away the organization. For example, the Bolivarian circles are central for Chavez in his initial phase in power. But in the end, they are integrated. Now, this is the interesting part, is that generally the populist government does not abolish the other movements. It integrates them, it statizes them, it defangs them. Each country, this has to be studied separately. But I think that that would be the full answer to Juan, that it's different in the movement phase, different in the governmental phase. And if a populism is able to form itself into a regime, and right now I only have Venezuela under the current circumstances as a candidate, then societal independence is radically subverted. Maduro is more hostile to it than Chavez ever was, and Chavez is more hostile to it as his government proceeds in time. And so in that sense, civil society problem is different for populism in its different phases. Okay.
Thank you, Andrew. I think that, Rodrigo, are you there for the question that you had?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Okay, the question was, I have it, I wrote it somewhere. Give me a second. Okay, the thing is, in your text, you focus on the theological element of the people, and I wanted to ask if there is a theological element in the idea of sovereignty itself.
Well, that's what Carl Schmitt said, right? That's how Carl Schmitt begins to even talk about political theology. If I'm not mistaken, I don't have the German text now, or the English, whatever, but it's called Three Studies on Sovereignty. Let me. It was called Politische Theologie in German, 4 Kapitel zur Lehre von der Souveränität, 4 chapters on the theory of sovereignty. So that's exactly how he demonstrated the presence of of political theology in the contemporary world by focusing on the modern state as a sovereign state that takes over a characteristic from what was initially in Catholic theology the dimension of God. Now, then others who follow him, like Ernst Kantorowicz in The King's Two Bodies, shows that this then requires a two-body conception, because the popular sovereign, in any case, ambivalent as a single unified center of power, and as a plurality. Rousseau's general will and the will of all are different. So sovereignty is a theological concept, and it is complex exactly in the way that the theological concepts are. Remember, in Kantorowicz, it's Christ who has the two bodies. And you all know this. You grew up, most of you, in that tradition. Christ obviously is completely man and completely God, and can act in both of those capacities because he can perform a miracle. I mean, you grew up on this, so I'm not telling you something new, right? He can perform a miracle, which is not a magician. There's only one person who can perform a miracle, even in the New Testament. Only he can do this, right? There's no other. The other magicians are fakers. They are just pretending. But at the same time, he can suffer. God cannot suffer. God the Father can't suffer. Maybe we break his heart sometimes, and he suffers as a result of that. But in reality, he can't suffer in a bodily way. But Christ can. That's the whole point. That's how he redeems us. So this is really a theological concept. He's sovereign, but he can suffer. Amazing, right? It's an amazing tradition, but it is taken over into politics. And once it is taken into politics, it becomes a real problem. Because if you say you can put it becomes, of course, heretical, right? If you're a good Catholic, you can't accept that. You can't accept Chavez pretending that he's Christ. And sometimes he really, as I understand it, he was tempted to play this game, right? Of at the same time speaking about the authority and at the same time presenting himself as a sufferer.
Maduro, I think that I remember that he
Maduro
used this.
Gets to suffer more.
Yes, Maduro used this image of the Holy Spirit represented in a pigeon. So,
that's what Chavez became for him.
Yeah.
He didn't say, I'm Maduro. That'd be ridiculous anyway, because the guy has no charisma at all. So he had to present somebody who really did have charisma. I mean, Hugo Chavez was a very talented man, obviously. And so in that sense, but this is what was done with Lenin, right? I mean, to put Lenin into a tomb like an Egyptian pharaoh was a kind of strange thing to do for Lenin, who was a radical atheist, but they did it. So in this sense, the populists are not the first, but it's profoundly problematic. It's profoundly problematic. Now, your question ought to be, Rodrigo, can we free sovereignty from its political theological dimension? I'm putting a question into your mouth, but it is a very important follow-up question, because sovereignty is a very important feature of the state system. We can't just, Peru has to guard its sovereignty against other states. I mean, you don't just allow Chileans to enter Peru and start taking over part of your territory. They did it in the past, right? But this can't, the Peruvian sovereignty means no. And that also means from the north and whatever it is. So there is a territorial aspect to it. But then, the idea that the territory is to be preserved has to be linked to some political institutions, political instances that are capable of of defending their territory? And how do you stop them from taking on a kind of political theological aura? Well, that's the problem of modern democracy. That's the problem of modern democracy. The modern democratic state does have sovereignty. And even when it delegates part of its sovereignty to an organization like OAS in your case, or European Union in the European case, you preserve sovereignty. It is a relatively free delegation. And so in that sense, its exercise becomes an issue. And modern democracy tries to solve that problem. One of the ways of doing it is, and this is in the tradition of Claude Lefort, who is anticipated by Carré de Malberg, another famous French legal theorist, is that nobody, no instance can incorporate sovereignty. It's an anti-embodiment model. We have sovereignty and we collectively can exercise it in a democratic way, but no instance can claim, I am God, or I am the sovereign, or I am the people. And that's difficult, right? Because then you have to deal with disunity and competition. And how do you preserve your sovereignty in that case? And I think democratic politics seeks to answer that, and most of the time successfully. But it is a challenge. The modern state and democracy have to some extent competing logics. Okay, I see Mario and Alessandro.
Yes.
Who I now discovered the hand technique of putting in the hand, which is what you all discover in these Zooms.
Yeah.
It's nice because, sometimes you can't see everybody if there's enough people in the class. So you decide who goes first.
Yeah, I think that Alessandro was first, then Mario. Yes, I don't know. Alessandro, si es corta, la podemos juntar con la de Mario de repente, pero siéntete libre y me dices ahí cómo vas.
Bien, ¿cómo se llama esa conexión entre populismo y teología política, ¿no?
Okay, sorry. Okay, go ahead, sorry. I just remind me, I wanted to tell you something. Okay.
Okay, yes, okay. Sí, Alessandro, sigue, perdón.
Siguiendo esa conexión entre teología política y populismo, y viendo, por ejemplo, el fenómeno de un candidato como López Aliaga que pretende, digamos, tener una especie de populismo católico dentro del Perú como opción política. Y la pregunta es esta, digamos, es esa expresión de populismo católico, digamos, no es simplemente una expresión que tiene mucho en común con cualquier otro tipo de populismo, ya sea de izquierda o de derecha, más allá de quitando lo católico, de todas maneras hay algo de teología detrás de todo eso. También el populismo de derecha, de izquierda.
Gracias. Gracias, Sandro. A ver, I'm gonna, Andrew, I'm gonna make this question in English, and maybe we can also give Mario the time for formulating his own question. So the question of Alessandro is with regard to the connection between political theology and populism. In Peru, currently, we have, in the current elections, we have a candidate which is like quite a bit similar as Bolsonaro, which is Rafael López Aliaga. And this López Aliaga proposed a sort of Catholic populism in Peru as an feasible political option. So the question of Alessandro is, this kind of Catholic populism, I mean, that is not the same, or maybe it's the same thing, or how can I formulate this? It's like talking about the Catholic populism is not like a redundance, it's not redundant in terms of that both left populism and right-wing populism share these kind of theological features, which so talking about Catholic populism is more a redundancy issue instead of a new thing in that way. Yes, this was the question of Alessandro.
Okay.
Mario.
Okay. Yeah. My question is connected to the last part of your paper on socialism and populism, where you propose this content of a minimal and a maximal program for reconstructive socialism. And here in Peru, it's hard to make claims related to the maximal program because of the fact that in the 1980s, we have a period of terrorism with radical left movements. So Fujimori in the 1990s used this to criticize severely to any kind of leftist movement. So even nowadays, whenever a political party make a claim connected to that, it is immediately labeled as terrorist. So my question is not related to Peru, but are there some successful political parties in Europe or in Eastern Europe with the maximal program? How have they work over there? And I think it's interesting because as in Eastern Europe, the countries emancipated from the Soviet Union, and I suppose many people have hard feelings against leftist ideology, maybe it's interesting to make a contrast with the Peruvian situation.
All right, so here, I think two really interesting questions also. Now, to Alessandro, I think that the idea of host ideology can be, of course, nationalism and socialism, but it can also be many other things. There are many populists who say they are neither left or right, and who are beyond that political antagonism altogether, and who rely on other dimensions of political life, other traditions to mobilize. Catholicism, from point of view of my article, represents a problem because there's no reason why populists themselves will not use Catholicism as a host ideology and rely on it. And of course, that could mean left or right, depending on which wing, which tradition of the church you'll focus on, because there's social Catholicism, like the wonderful nuns who took me to the favela in Lima. They were all radical leftists and very good Catholics too. So Catholicism could mean leftism, but of course it could mean corporatism. It could mean authoritarianism. It depends on the wing of the church, the dimension of the church. Bolsonaro, you mentioned, obviously, he is more reliant on the evangelicals, I think my understanding is, but they're pretty authoritarian, the evangelicals there. I don't know about Peru, where you also have evangelicals, but this description fits them. The nuns did not like them when I went with Romero to visit them. The nuns thought that we're leftists, these evangelicals are right.
Yeah.
That's what the nuns said. But I don't know if that's true or not. It may be true.
Yes, this Lopez Aliaga is he's a member of the Opus Dei. I don't know if you heard about this Opus Dei.
Yeah. No, of course. That's the right-wing Catholic.
So he's a right-wing Catholic.
My student, Jose Casanova, wrote a dissertation on the Opus Dei, so I know what that is. But in any case, this is a problem from the Catholic side, because I argued, at least, now of course they're not going to read me or worry about me, I argued that populism is heretical. You can't put idols in the place of Christ, right? You know, you have to understand, in that sense, that political authority has a kind of derived or secondary authorization. Yeah, of course, give Caesar what is Caesar and give God to what is God's, but it's Christ who said so. Caesar cannot grasp this authority on his own. Well, he did in Rome, but he was not supposed to with respect to the Palestinian population. There it was the rabbi, namely Jesus Christ, who said, well, you know, you guys should accept that God has something to do with putting this heretical pagan, or not heretical, but this, well, for a Jew, he was, what's his name? Herod was heretical, but the Romans are just plain pagans. And you give them what is theirs because that's the way God organized things. That's not the populist way of speaking. So in that sense, I think there is going to be a tension. The evangelicals, see, I like the nuns because the evangelicals are right. Protestantism is more statocentric than Catholicism. So it's kind of easier to you know, in the United States, we have this too. The evangelicals are with Trump all the way. The Catholics are much more divided. So I think that the evangelicals are, I don't want to, you know, speak against anybody, right? In Peru, they're very strong, right? But it is they who would be more prone to the populist to the populist heresy, I would say, than the Catholics. I mean, the Catholics got the Pope. The Pope is not going to say, give everything that he wants to Bolsonaro. That's the last thing he's going to say, right? I mean, you know him. He's a man of the people, at least these days, because during the junta, he was not so sure. But these days, he is on the right side of most things. And he's never going to say, give everything to Bolsonaro or Chavez for that matter, but judge them by the moral guidance of the church. And they're going to be wanting, I suspect, Bolsonaro, who's a killer, potentially, right? He's not really going to measure up to the Catholic ethos. Now, what's the other question? I'm talking so much. With religion, I just go off.
Yeah,
I wanted to say something before the other question.
The question. Just remind me.
Yes,
In the case of López Aliaga, there are too many candidates.
Europe. Yeah, I got it. Yeah, I remember. But
yes,
East Europe, you're absolutely right. In East Europe, after communism, left populism is not a very plausible option. Nor is even the version of socialism which my article promotes, which is a kind of synthesis between market-oriented and socially protectionist doctrines. Eastern Europe is not the place where I think the chances for either of those two things are going to be most likely. We have right populism. We have right-wing populism. In Poland, more religious. In Poland, it is more connected to Catholicism. In Hungary, Orban, occasionally, I guess he goes to church, but he doesn't mean it. And actually, his reforms and not very religious in respect to that. So that will depend on the individual country. Hungary is not a very church-going country, so it's not going to be a religiously based populism. Poland, much more likely. But no, the socialist option, I outline in my paper because it's a theoretical paper. But in Europe right now, there's no sign anywhere of that type of alternative emerging. But my point was that if you're going to fight, in this case, left populism, which makes all kinds of social promises and even delivers them as long as enough energy resources can be wasted, because Chavez has delivered to some extent, and Morales has delivered to some extent, Whether they can continue to do so is another question. But my proposal is not based on having the world's second most oil or the second most or so much natural gas as does Bolivia. And I think that it's time to begin to think about alternatives. But I'm not suggesting that in each country you can just adopt what I proposed. It is actually an option for European welfare states, what I proposed in that paper. Okay, do we still have time? Yeah, I think we have time for maybe one or two more.
Yes, Andrew, I think that Gabriel has a commentary.
I wanted to say this before Professor Arato responds to Mario's question, that in the case of López Aliaga, there are too many evangelical leaders that are applying for the parliament. There are too many evangelical leaders.
Oh yes, Gabriel refers to this Catholic right-wing populist who is running now for the elections, because he grouped both conservative Catholics, but also a lot of people from evangelism. And I think that the point of the coincidence of these two groups is the pro-life or anti-abortist discourse, I think. Well, I think that it's the same quite a bit in Brazil, but I am not sure totally, but it's in that way. Yeah.
Look, we have this in the United States.
Oh, that's true.
I mean, in terms of the vote, people of Latin American background in the U.S., I would say that there is about 20%, 25% that vote for Trump. Now, okay, there's a part of that is Cuban. So we know a very special reason for Florida Cubans to go with the Republicans, but that's not the whole 25%. The rest is this issue that you mentioned. It's not just abortion, but issues connected to feminism, to gender rights, which conservative Catholics, whatever the Pope, the Pope would not be voting for Trump, but he doesn't give any guidance on American U.S. elections. I doubt that he gives the Peruvian elections any kind of direct guidance either, or Argentinian ones. And so you're going to get some of these kinds of coalitions. And it's weird, right? I mean, you ally yourself with evangelicals if you're a right-wing Catholic. That's pretty strange on some level theologically, right? Because after all, they're not supposed to have a really friendly relationship, but the social content begins to dominate over the theological one. The point I wanted to mention to you, Cesar, is that I notice you're recording this. And I want you, first of all, you have to ask people, but if they agree to share the recording with my class, Udipta is the one who
oh, yes, I can send it to Udipta. Yeah.
I think this discussion is much higher level than what we're doing in class. And in that sense, I really appreciate it and I would like to save it. So if they don't mind, and they shouldn't because everybody says such great things, if they don't mind, then Cesar will give this to Udipta Chakravarti, who is sitting in New Delhi, but at the same time he actually runs the course, and he can post it. And I'd like to, for me, because this is a really a superior discussion to whatever else we have been doing.
Thank you, Andrew, for the proposal. Sí, Andrew está diciendo que si le podemos pasar luego el video para los que no han seguido mucho lo último, porque quiere colgarlo en la web de los videos que tiene sobre el curso de populismo en New School. Entonces, no sé si todos están de acuerdo, luego lo podemos discutir. I think that for finishing the discussion, the last question of Ronald, I think that he has there is one more question, so this is the last one. Go ahead, Ronald.
Yeah, thank you. My question is related to political theory. in your description of Lefort's work, the Kings to Bodies doctrine is a useful and a necessary step for giving an account of these two dominions, the politics and the political. So there is a symbolic dominion, and my question is, how can we understand this space? I question this because one of the reasons which apparently supports populism is the idea that there is an irreducible, irrational component in politics which finds expression in this kind of radical antagonism between friend and enemy. So my question would be if you share this image or in general, how can we understand this space?
That's great. That's a good place to end. I was very friendly with Claude Lefort, and you know, I think in the essay on political theology, I have a chance to cite him, and even debated Laclau, who also was influenced by Lefort, but we take two different ways out of Lefort. What Laclau does is basically argue on a track that you just hinted, namely that that politics has an irreducible, irrational dimension, and that will mean that people will emerge who will try to fill the empty space of power with powerful rhetorical appeals. Laclau thought this was good, though he didn't commit himself to permanent filling of the space of power, and he implied that it would be successive movements and challenges that would do so. He doesn't make it clear, and certainly given a populist government, it would become much more difficult for alternative forms of politics to emerge to fill the empty space of power. My link to Lefort is more critical because I think that Claude Lefort analyzed totalitarianism, which primarily had to do with the obliteration of what you could just call the symbolic and the real, in the sense that it is actual institutions that pretend to be the symbolic reference point for political life rather than ideas like that of democracy, which in Lefort's view insist on keeping the space of power empty. So totalitarianism not only fills the space of power, but also obliterates the distinction between symbolic and real. For me, populism is not totalitarian in Lefort's sense. It's not totalitarian. It does not obliterate the distinction between the symbolic and the real. Now, what the symbolic is, it could be 21st century socialism, it could be a political theology, it could be a combination of the two. Generally, political theology plays some kind of role. But what populism does, it tries to fill the space of power. In other words, it eliminates the contest, or seeks to eliminate the context of who holds power. The only legitimate holder of power is us. Viktor Orban, who's the Prime Minister of Hungary, famously said after losing an election, the fatherland, patria, the homeland, I guess in Hungarian, it doesn't have father in it. The homeland cannot be in opposition, which means that even when you lose an election, you are the true holder of political power. In this sense, the empty space has been filled, and elections have nothing to do with who's supposed to operate in the name of the people. It is us, and we are the only ones who have the symbolic authority to do this. Now, this is not totalitarian in the Lefortian sense, because there's a reference to a symbolic identity between leader, party, and people. And there is therefore a special symbolic frame which is beyond the rational. You cannot prove through rational arguments, Habermasian arguments, that we are the people. That can only be plausibly suggested by someone with very strong charismatic authority. In other words, a special psychological bond needs to be created between people and leader, between leader and led. Otherwise, the idea that I am the people, any one of you can say, I am Peru, it would be a joke. But maybe somebody of the 30 electoral competitors will get away with it. How could Fujimori get away with it? Now, that's a question I'm sure all of you ask yourself, right? Hayo de la Torre, right? He was the founder. He was supposed to be an individual with great popular appeal. How did Fujimori get away with it? I mean, that's a question that you must ask yourself. Of course, he only gets away with it for the majority of the electorate. He doesn't get away with it for everybody. But that is the trick, because then you unite electoral authorization, majority rule, which is rational. That's not irrational. Who's supposed to rule in a democracy but the majority, right? I mean, the only choice is majority or minority. But the majority is not supposed to be a permanent majority. It is supposed to be a temporary majority, which can be rearranged and redesigned according to the next election. To say that that majority is now the people in a permanent or semi-permanent way requires an irrational step. That's your point, right? That is, you can't get from majority rule of the ordinary type to majority rule in the populist sense, except through a leap. Mm-hmm. And that's the leap which I'm with Max Weber on this, which I think requires charismatic authority, because just a political party is a part in every one of our Indo-European languages. A party is a part, so it cannot be the whole. The party must have a leader who can stand for the whole. Why? I'm just reading this text of Trotsky. I mean, the Bolsheviks had one policy before Lenin arrived on the scene in April 1917. And he changed them completely. And when he was hiding during the repression of July of 1917, the Bolsheviks again were going their own way. But once he appeared, and he appeared in such a strange way, he had to mask himself, cut his beard. When he appeared, suddenly they came around to his views. There are people like that. And that's the charismatic part. Sometimes an election produces it. Sometimes it is charisma that leads to being elected. Weber knew this very well, that the link between a plebiscite and the charismatic leadership could go either way. It's not as if Hugo Chavez woke up one morning, he had charisma. It didn't seem to have it when he tried to carry out a military coup in 1992 or 3, whenever it was that he tried, right? But once elected by so many people, so in his case, it's the election that produces the authority. And in some other cases, it is the quality of the person that produces the electoral majority. But whatever it is, these two things then reinforce one another, the rational and the irrational. It's rational that Fujimori, after being elected, should be able to make choices for the Peruvian political community, but that he should get away with a self-coup is weird, right? I mean, I don't mean to criticize your political community, but that you should let him get away with that was kind of strange. You know, this Japanese guy, he says, you know, that my interests are identical to the interests of the precariat. I mean, come on. And now the daughter tries to pull the same. I mean, how can you get away with that? Well, he did. And there was something that he was able to do under those circumstances. And that's where that's where Ronald is trying to place the irrational, because there's no rational explanation of that. His neoliberalism got him some votes. I mean, he realized that competing with Vargas Llosa previously, right, that Vargas Llosa was able to get some votes. So he wanted some of those votes too. That's still rational. It's not attractive to simultaneously say opposite things to different people, but it works in politics. But that he should get away with even carrying on a self-coup and autogolpe, that required something else. No, I don't mean to say that it is only charisma, because I don't even see it in his case, or where his charisma could possibly have been. But other parties sometimes through their actions make it easier for people to do things like this. But Morales and Chavez and Correa did have something additional to just an electoral victory. Okay.
Okay, Andrew, thank you very much. We are very glad to have you here. I don't know if Alessandro wants to say last words for finishing with this session. You can make it in Spanish and I can translate if you want, or yeah. Alessandro? We are mute. Estás en mudo, Alessandro.
Bueno, gracias por aceptar nuestra invitación y gracias por compartir, digamos, estas ideas que son valiosas para nosotros y, ¿cómo se llama? Y participar en cierto modo del debate y la discusión sobre ese tema que es tan importante para el mundo contemporáneo.
Alessandro said, Andrew, that thank you very much for giving us some time for discussing this topic. Thank you very much for sharing with us your ideas. And this was a very fruitful session in which we discussed a very important topic in contemporary world. And it was very, very good for us to share this time with you. So thank you very much. And I don't know if I can take a quick photo of us only for register, Andrew. I don't know if it is okay. With you. Okay. I think that I can. Okay. 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 Sonrían todos. 1, 2, 3. Okay. So
you're doing it.
Yes, I already did that, I think, with a print in here.
We did another, yeah. Well,
but
do yes. What you have to.
So thank you very much, Andrew. We really appreciate that, and also we hope that maybe we can again have a meeting with you if you have time, and also if you think that it could be a good idea. We really appreciate this session. It would be very, very formative for us.
No, I love to do this. It's a great group, and the questions were really superb. And you know, for me, it's also an opportunity to think through my own ideas and to listen to yours, and it's really very exciting. So I'm certainly willing to do it. You know. My schedule is a little heavy because I teach Tuesday, Thursday, Wednesday, and then we have the seminar on Friday. But Mondays are available. So if you feel like a month from now to do it again, and around maybe some other papers or in some other version, I could certainly do it again. Then I teach again at the Central European University starting later in April, so it would have to be in the relatively early part of April, if you wanted to do it.
Or maybe
then you can do it in the fall. Obviously, we
yeah.
can do it in the fall when I'm much freer. So I would definitely, and if you can save the recording, that would be great, because I like this and the questions are excellent. And you know, your perspective, I think, is both because of the very different backgrounds of people here, and also because you live in a country where this has been an issue. And so that makes things much better.
Yes, thank you very much, Andrew. And also maybe in the fall we can contact you, or maybe have a session with maybe with Federico or with Carlos, if they agree also, but let's see how can we manage this.
Well, that would be interesting.
Yes.
With Nicholas would be, I would enjoy it. Although then, you know, we might fight because he has a very different view on this. And, you know, he's been in politics himself and he understands, but on the other hand, well, I don't want to get into polemic now. So we'll leave that for the fall.
Okay, Andrew, thank you very much. And Professor Angel Gomez, who was here and he left before we finish, said also thank you very much to Andrew, and he really appreciated the time. So this is our finish of the meeting. Thank you very much, Andrew.
I'm going to leave.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Creo que tengo que parar esto acá, el stop, ¿no?
Sí, dale stop.